So I don't know if you guys have seen it yet in theaters, but the Running Man remake just cratered at the box office. They're going to lose over $100 million on this one. So let's talk about how Hollywood spent over $2 billion redoing movies we already liked, and somehow made every single one worse. One of them was so bad the director actually went to prison over it. Paramount dropped $110 million on this reboot starring Glenn Powell, who's been everywhere lately. Top Gun, Twisters, all big box office hits. On paper, it looked like a sure thing. Edgar Wright directing, a new adaptation of Stephen King's story, and a premise that should have been easy: one man against assassins in a dystopian hellscape. Didn't matter. The Running Man just fell flat. It opened with only $17 million in the US, $28.6 worldwide. Paramount was blindsided. Lionsgate had a bigger weekend with Now You See Me 3. It pulled in over $75 million global. So much for Glenn Powell's third tentpole. There's been a lot of talk about what went wrong. Some blame the remake for not really feeling like an Edgar Wright movie or just being a bad remake, but behind the scenes, this flop is about management f***ups. Thing is, Running Man got greenlit under the old regime at Paramount, then the entire C-suite changed over to David Ellison's team. When that happens, new execs inherit a bunch of movies they don't care about, or even want to bury. And there's this mess in their marketing department. Their marketing boss, Mark Weinstock, left, and Paramount sat in limbo waiting for the new guy, Josh Goldstein, to show up. He didn't get there until a month before release. During all this, the marketing team had no direction. The studio was cutting jobs, and nobody could make a decision. Goldstein is the guy who pulled off big launches like Dune 2 and The Batman for Warner Brothers. But there's only so much anyone can do when they show up to a campaign already falling apart. In the end, none of it would have mattered if the movie was any good. If you make something people want to see, word of mouth takes over and saves at least part of the box office. That didn't happen here. This was just a bad remake nobody wanted. Sometimes I feel like Hollywood just loves remaking two things: cartoons into live action and Schwarzenegger action movies. Conan the Barbarian is the perfect example. This 2011 version starred Jason Momoa. He should have been a natural for a role like Conan, but the movie just didn't land with anyone. Domestically, it took in barely $21 million with a total worldwide gross of $63.5 million on a $90 million budget. Factor in marketing, and it's a huge loss. The studio was hoping for a new franchise. Instead, they got nothing. The project bounced around Hollywood for years. Warner Brothers spent 7 years trying to get it moving. The Wachowskis, John Milius, even Robert Rodriguez all took a shot, but it kept falling apart. Eventually, Marcus Nispel landed the directing job. He's more famous in the industry for his ego than for his movies. Lionsgate put up $25 million just for US rights. They poured money into marketing, hoping for a big launch. But the tracking numbers were already pointing to a flop, and then reviews finished it off. Basically, the movie missed everything what made the original work. Momoa looked the part, but the script was a mess top to bottom. Generic dialogue, nothing memorable, all computer graphics instead of practical. Even Momoa admits the whole thing was taken over and turned into a big pile of shit. And director Marcus Nispel called it the worst experience he had, describing it as a dog on many leashes. Back in the 2000s, studios went looking for old properties to repackage. Instead of picking something everybody wanted, MGM dusted off Rollerball, a 1975 cult classic about a violent dystopian sport. The remake was supposed to be a hard R action movie under John McTiernan, the guy who directed Die Hard. He wanted violence and nudity, but the studio panicked and started messing around. Scenes got chopped up, violence toned down, night vision slapped over entire sequences, shadows added to cover nudity, and blood literally changed to sweat with digital effects. All that studio interference ballooned the budget to $70 million. The result was a film that made no sense, got trashed by critics, and was surrounded by nothing but negative buzz. Rollerball crashed in 2002, earning just $25.8 million worldwide. It was so bad it actually stood as one of the most expensive box office bombs for years. And that's not even the craziest part. McTiernan actually went to jail over this. Turns out he fought with producer Charles Roven about what kind of movie Rollerball should be. So he hired infamous Hollywood fixer Anthony Pellicano to wiretap Roven, hoped to catch him bad-mouthing studio execs. When the FBI came asking about it, McTiernan lied to investigators. That move got him sentenced to a year in federal prison in 2013. If there's one thing Hollywood really believes in, it's Tom Cruise. So when Universal tried to launch their own cinematic universe, they handed Cruise $195 million and expected gold. Instead, they got one of the biggest box office bombs of 2017. Everyone remembers the 1999 Brendan Fraser version. It was a hit, and it worked because it had heart. Universal's reboot wanted to launch an entire dark universe, all the old monsters, big crossover plans, the Marvel treatment. The problem was the movie didn't know what it wanted to be. It tried to balance horror and action because it's Tom Cruise after all, but failed at both. The Mummy pulled in a worldwide box office of $410 million, which sounds big until you see the costs. Production plus marketing hit about $345 million. Once theaters take their share, the movie didn't even break even. Universal had to shut down the dark universe before it could even get started. The Old Mummy got 2 sequels and a spin-off. The New Mummy killed an entire franchise. Every few years, someone in Hollywood gets the idea to remake a classic by swapping the cast. They hope it'll feel fresh, but most of the time it just feels awkward. Ghostbusters 2016 is the textbook case. $144 million budget, all-female leads, and non-stop PR, selling it as a culture war event instead of just, making a funny movie people actually want to see. Controversy started before the movie even opened. Fans thought the remake was unnecessary, and social media turned it into a full-on brawl. It made just $229 million worldwide, which is way short when your costs are as high as this. Sony lost about $70 million on it, and any hope for a sequel died quick. They had to bring back the old Ghostbusters timeline with Afterlife just to reset the brand. What's wild is how everyone involved just keeps blaming the audience, the fans, or politics for why it didn't work. Melissa McCarthy blamed people being afraid of women, Leslie Jones blamed racism and misogyny, and director Paul Feig blamed Trump supporters. Basically any excuse but the actual movie itself. Look, it wasn't the worst movie ever, but it just wasn't good. The script was weak, the whole thing fell off, and people just moved on. The problem with Ben-Hur is that it was already made and everyone has already seen it, and it stars Charlton Heston. You can stream it anytime you want. I'm not sure what these folks made, but it wasn't Ben-Hur, and honestly, I'm not sure why they did it. But here's how it happened. In 2013, MGM got a $650 million credit line from JP Morgan. Finally enough cash to start acting like a real studio again. Flush with that new money, MGM put Ben-Hur into active development as their big comeback, even though everyone already knew the story and nobody was asking for a redo. Paramount jumped on as partner, and together they pushed the marketing hard. Huge ad buys during the Rio Olympics, Olympic athletes cut into the TV spots, all of it. The tracking was soft even with all that hype. Paramount hoped for a $20 million opening, but more realistic numbers were closer to 15. The reality was even worse. $11 million opening weekend, number 6 at the box office, and left in the dust by Suicide Squad and Sausage Party. The original Ben-Hur won 11 Oscars, set a gold standard for epic filmmaking, and starred Charlton Heston. This remake, directed by Timur Bekmambetov, just didn't have any reason to exist. Producers Mark Burnett and Roma Downey had hyped it up as the most anticipated movie release of 2016, then went silent as the movie sank. With a $100 million budget and $94 million global box office, Ben-Hur bombed. The Total Recall remake is a weird byproduct of Hollywood bankruptcy and rights auctions gone wrong. Coralco Pictures, the original studio, imploded after legendary disasters like Cutthroat Island. In 1997, the rights to Total Recall, sequels, prequels, remakes, were auctioned off in bankruptcy court. Miramax grabbed them for $3 million, tried to get a sequel made with Schwarzenegger, burned through draft after draft, and then just sat on it when nothing worked. After the Weinsteins left Miramax, Disney held the rights for a while. In 2009, Sony picked them up, with Miramax holding an option to co-finance. They wisely passed on that. Sony went all in and shelled out $125 million on a family-friendly version. They handed the lead to Colin Farrell, who was already a box office risk at the time. Marketing was everywhere, but nobody cared. Tracking suggested 25 to 30 million opening, and it hit the bottom end at 25.5, opening behind The Dark Knight Rises, which was already in week 3. Reviews were mostly negative. Audiences gave it a toxic C+ cinema score, and Sony quickly saw the writing on the wall. In their own financial report, Sony pointed to Total Recall as the main reason their profits from The Amazing Spider-Man were eaten up. In the 2020s, it felt like every studio rushed to pump out live-action remakes, and usually those make plenty of money. The Little Mermaid looked like a guaranteed hit, a beloved animated classic, 2 Academy Awards, and songs everybody knows by heart. But Disney decided to go all in. Casting Halle Bailey as Ariel set off a wave of online drama. People complained she didn't look like the 1989 animated version or Hans Christian Andersen's original description. But that was just the beginning of the film's problems. $240 million was the official budget, but according to Forbes' report, the real number hit $380 million. Add marketing and the cost shot up past $500 million. Most of the money went to a cast of digital fish and underwater CGI, which only made the movie look creepier. The result was a miscast Black Ariel, a bunch of weird CGI sea creatures, and a remake that nobody asked for. The losses probably went into the hundreds of millions. The Little Mermaid is in the same league as legendary Disney bombs like John Carter and Tomorrowland. Remake fever was in full swing in the early 2010s, but Universal decided to dodge a direct remake of John Carpenter classic and instead put out a prequel, still called The Thing. Producers Mark Abraham and Eric Newman convinced the studio it was worth digging up. What's funny to me here, they literally said remaking Carpenter would be like painting a mustache on the Mona Lisa. They should have listened to their own warning and left it alone. Development started back in 2006, but the project only really took shape by 2009. Universal and Strike Entertainment split the $38 million budget. The studio wanted a prime horror release, but then came the problems. The film was pulled for pricey reshoots, and Universal decided the original practical effects weren't enough. So they went with expensive CGI that ended up replacing most of the already finished work. To push the movie, Universal went hard on marketing. They even added a Thing-themed maze at Halloween Horror Nights in their theme park, but nothing helped. The film opened to less than $9 million and topped out at just $31.5 million worldwide. Hollywood's been remaking Invasion of the Body Snatchers since the 50s, and 2 versions, the 1956 original and the 1978 update, are still considered classics. So in 2007, Warner Brothers thought it's time to remake it yet again, this time with Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig. The result was a textbook case of how not to handle a remake. Production was a mess from the start. The movie wrapped in December 2005, originally aiming for a summer 2006 release. After seeing Oliver Hirschbiegel's cut, the studio ditched it and ordered massive rewrites, handled by the Wachowskis. They brought in James McTeague to direct 17 days of reshoots, mostly adding generic action scenes. The film's budget ballooned to $65 million, and release was pushed back to late summer 2007. By the time the invasion finally landed, everyone knew there was trouble behind the scenes. Word got out about the reshoots and director swap, and tracking was already weak. The movie was basically toxic at that point. It opened against Superbad and The Last Legion and bombed with just $5.9 million that weekend. Its box office run ended at $40 million worldwide on a reported $80 million budget. After all the piecemeal edits and reworking, The Invasion lost almost $60 million after everything was counted. Russell Brand was suddenly everywhere for a few years, and somebody at Warner Brothers got it into their head he could carry a movie. Producer Larry Bresner still had the remake rights to the original 1981 Arthur through his company, so in 2008 they started looking for a way to cash in. The original was a smash, but this remake was designed as a showcase for Russell Brand, and he'd later call it a mistake. That's about right. They put $40 million into it, stacked the marketing, and gave it the full studio push. Brand got top billing, his first and only real shot at being a studio lead, but obviously he couldn't carry it because Russell Brand isn't a movie star, never was. Critics called the performance career-killing, and anyone who remembered the original just ended up disappointed. The movie finished at $47.7 million worldwide, which left tens of millions of marketing spend completely in the red. The budget didn't even get covered by the actual theatrical run. Brand was never able to open a movie by himself, and this flop proved it. After Arthur, Hollywood stopped trying to make him happen as a lead. The original Oldboy, directed by Puck Chinook, is a classic. The American remake had a $25.8 million budget and brought in just $5 million. Basically, they had no clue what made the first one work. Spike Lee was in the director's chair with Josh Brolin starring alongside Elizabeth Olsen. But from the beginning, something was off. They tried to copy the story. Man locked up for 20 years, released without explanation, goes looking for answers. But what made the Korean version unique just got lost. The studio cut Spike Lee's version by almost an hour after he turned it in. They even chopped up the big fight scene that was supposed to be filmed as one continuous shot. What ended up on screen was a watered-down imitation, like a generic revenge flick. Film District, the U.S. distributor, didn't even bother to market it seriously. They shuffled release dates, dumped it in theaters right up against Frozen and a handful of other movies over Thanksgiving. Film District was already going under. They basically folded after this flop with Oldboy as their last release. Spike Lee himself called it the worst experience of his career and said flat out, the film that hit theaters was not the one he and Josh Brolin made. Stallone was on a cold streak when he signed up for Get Carter. He hadn't headlined a hit since Copland. When this one hit theaters, Warner Brothers didn't even bother screening it for critics. The movie opened against Meet the Parents and Digimon the Movie and pulled $6.6 million opening weekend. Good for third place. People hated it, slapped it with a D+ cinema score, and the box office never recovered. The final take was just $19 million off a $63 million reported budget. But that budget was its own story. Get Carter was financed by Franchise Pictures and Germany's Entertainment. After seeing how cheap the finished film looked, Entertainment's CEO dug into the numbers and found out Franchise had cooked the books. Franchise boss Eli Samaha invented approved overages, phony costs, and fake deferments. Like, for example, a made-up $8 million perks for Stallone. Mark Canton was supposedly paid $6 million as producer, but actually got just $1.5 million. There were $3 million in fees that went to nobody. So Entertainment sued and won $77 million, and by 2004, Franchise Pictures was wiped out. As for Stallone, after Get Carter, he was mostly off studio posters. Driven's campaign barely showed his face, and Avenging Angelo skipped theaters completely. It took years for him to recover. The original film was another MGM property with a recognizable title, and MGM wanted to squeeze some money out of it. The remake follows a group of teenagers fighting back after North Korea suddenly invades the U.S. This time, it's Spokane, Washington. The cast included Chris Hemsworth, before he was Thor, Josh Hutcherson, and Josh Peck. They called themselves the Wolverines, fought with guerrilla tactics, and basically tried to recapture the small-town underdog thing that worked the first time. but this remake never had a chance. MGM was deep in debt, $3.7 billion, and basically running on fumes. Mary Parent came in as chairman in 2008, picked a few projects she thought could make money fast, and Red Dawn was one of them. But MGM went bankrupt right as Red Dawn was being finished in 2010. With the studio in reorganization, everything stalled. The film sat on the shelf for a year until Film District finally bought the US rights and released it in late 2012. By the time Red Dawn hit theaters, all momentum was gone. Not that there ever was one. It opened against big holiday releases like Life of Pi and Twilight, got hammered by critics for its weak story and generic action, and made just $14 million its first weekend. It was nowhere near enough to make a dent in the $54 million budget. It limped to $50.9 million total, not even covering costs. Disaster movies can work if you catch the right cultural moment with the right cast. Poseidon didn't do any of that. This was a $160 million remake of The Poseidon Adventure, a 70s disaster film about a cruise ship flipped by a rogue wave. This time they brought in Wolfgang Petersen, who knew epic blockbusters after The Perfect Storm and Troy. The cast was solid with Kurt Russell, Richard Dreyfuss, and Josh Lucas, and the visual effects were good enough to score an Oscar nomination. But the whole project was a warning sign from the start. The script struggled to attract any truly bankable leads, but the studio put all its faith in Petersen and the idea that bigger visual effects could save anything. Poseidon landed in May 2006, right between Mission Impossible 3 and The Da Vinci Code, worst possible spot for a mid-level tentpole. Opening weekend brought in $22 million, and it eventually grossed $181.7 million worldwide. On the surface, that sounds okay, but with a $160 million budget and massive marketing spend, the math didn't work. Once the theaters took their cut, the studio was left with a loss. Petersen himself admitted he should never have done it. After this one, he stepped back from the studio system entirely.